What do you want to sit? In the middle? Sure. Okay, brilliant. Chinmoy, yeah. Yeah, hi. Okay. We are running a bit late, but I think it's not too late for this discussion. So we are extremely, oh, you want? Yeah, please, make sure. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, so I think it's important to get, seated comfortably in order to get to a discussion. So we are running late, but, I hope it's not too late to sort of muse on certain, heavy historical stuff. But of course, with Professor Guha and Professor Ivermee, I don't think it will be that heavy as well. Now, there was no introduction, so I'll just introduce both the personalities. So Professor Robert Ivermee is actually, historian on British and French colonialism, particularly in South Asia. And he's presently a professor at Sciences Po Grenoble. And one of the first introduction to Professor Ivermee was a wonderful book that he had written earlier, very popular, called Hooghly, The Global History of the River. It's a fascinating book. With Chinmoy, the introduction can get a bit longer. Of course, Professor Chinmoy Guha is a professor emeritus of Calcutta University, but that's only a part of what he is. In fact, he's a Sahitya Academy winner, also multiple award winner. There is, of course, a wonderful quote of Theodore Zeldin, the great French historian, who says that Chinmoy actually opens the door into unfamiliar civilizations because of his mastery of 3 different literatures. I think that's a very, very pertinent point. So what am I doing here? Of course, starting a conversation, but there is a bit of me here because I come from Chandanagar. And so when I think, Chandanagar was a French colony. And so whenever there is something with French in India, I am so interested. So probably that's my part. And unfortunately, I cannot speak French like them. So please, forgive me if I cannot be like that. But anyway, let's dive straight into the conversation because I think it's a very important subject, but not dealt with that much. And I want to open up with Professor Ivermee. This is the book that he has just written, Glorious Failure, The Forgotten History of French Imperialism in India. It's a fascinating book. And my last few days are consumed by this book because I could actually discover a lot of things that were not known to me even. I'm an avid reader of this part of history, but a lot of these things were not known to me. So, Professor, one thing I want to tell, and this is a kind of a very normal question to ask you. Why glorious and then sort of add failure to it? Of course, we can understand, but any imperial project to be glorious and then just to add failure or success sounds a bit, complicated. So that's the beginning point of the conversation. So can you sort of enlighten us?
Yeah, of course. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. So yeah, why glorious failure? It's a good question to start with because it introduces some of the main big ideas of the book. The first kind of obvious point to make is that French attempts to establish a large territorial empire in India failed, hence the emphasis on failure. One of the key arguments of the book is that France does want to become an imperial power in India. The book charts the development of French ambitions from the foundation of the first French East India Company in 1664, right through to the final defeat of those ambitions in the years just after the French Revolution. It's quite neat. In fact, the book covers a period of exactly 150 years between 1664 and 1814, when any realistic chance that France has of becoming a serious territorial power in India come to an end. So that explains really the emphasis on failure. As far as glory is concerned, we can look at this in more detail later on, really. But from the beginning, the French East India Company is a slightly different entity to its other European rivals. Unlike the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company, the French company is very much set up by the French state. It's a state or a government undertaking. And from the beginning, it's not only about commerce. From the beginning, there is an emphasis on extending the glory and the power of France into the Indian Ocean or into frontiers beyond Europe. Hence the emphasis on glory.
Oh.
When we put those two ideas together, glory and failure, well, we get to the term glorious failure. The idea is, I suppose, not that there's something inherently glorious in the idea of trying to become an imperial power.
Yeah.
Quite the opposite, in fact. The idea is that when French ambitions to become an imperial power in India are finally defeated, that defeat is an emphatic one. France has to watch on, or French figures in India have to watch on, as the British, of course, become the dominant European power. Sense is a failure that is ultimately emphatic or crushing.
Oh, yeah. I was thinking of Virgil and glory. Glory that. Okay. So thank you for sort of explaining that. Another thing I just want to tell about the book, and this is something that I grew up in Chandanagar, and there was this idea which Professor busts actually, that the French were basically a bit more benign, than the British, So the British are the ones who are the aggressors, and the French are more benign. They are more culturally inclined. But yeah, even in Chandanagar, I could see the differentiation between the black and the white population, which is there in Pondicherry in a much more probably, schizophrenic way. So, this busting of the myth of, the benignness of French imperial. Of course, you can, of course, read Sartre and, of course, go to Fanon, and we know about that. But from an Indian perspective, so somebody in Pondicherry or Mahe or Chandanagar looks at the other power, the more powerful British, and then they equate the French, and then there is this myth that comes out. So if you can tell in what ways you bust that myth.
Yeah, thank you. The book is intended as a bit of a challenge, I suppose, to older ways of writing the history of the French presence in India that argue that the French were only ever interested in commerce, that France never had ambitions to become a territorial power. The argument that France was a peaceful presence in India. The book, by telling the story of French imperialism over this 150-year period, offers a challenge to that set of ideas. I think in a lot of Francophone scholarship on this topic, there's been a tendency to argue looking backwards from what we know the outcome to have been. So we know that France failed to establish a large empire in India, and therefore we argue that France never really wanted an empire in India at all, reading backwards in a way that is quite problematic and which this book tries to move beyond. The origins of that idea, the origins of that rewriting of the history of French India to argue that France was a benign imperial power or even a positive one for the people of India, that project of rewriting history in that way begins almost as soon as France is defeated in a major conflict with Great Britain, the 7 Years' War, in the middle of the 18th century.
Right.
So one of the things that the second half of the book is concerned to do is to understand how thinking about French India was reinterpreted almost before that history had come to an end.
Okay. Okay. So, Chinmoy, I'll just come to you, of course. You are also an expert on this, and I'm more. So this is a book which is full of facts, and also it's full of what I call documentation, hardcore documentation. A lot of documentations which are normally not, parsed through, So when we talk about history, this is a wonderfully written book, by the way. And I'm not telling it because I'm here, because I've just dipped into it, and I thought that I know less and less as I am just looking at it. But Chinmoy, one thing that I want to talk about, because, of course, politically, if you look at, the French in India, it's a failed project. We all know that. But culturally, there is a huge French percolation, whether you like it or not. Of course, despite their smaller presence, the French in India, especially if you look at literature and other arts, that has got a resonance. So can you sort of enlighten us on that?
Yes, maybe we can talk about it later,
Okay.
after we hear from him about the political project of colonialism here. And he has indeed said that it was very aggressive for half of the 150 years,
Right.
when they were trying to sort of extend their influence, territory, and revenues through threat and fear. And we know that the French colonies were, the French Empire, I would say, all over the world, was the second largest after the British in the whole world. Unbelievable. In India, we had the Danes, the Portuguese, we had the Dutch, of course, and we had French and British. But it's very important to remember that they had 80 colonies all over the world, 80 colonies. In the two Americas, they had colonies in Africa. We all know about what happened in Algeria, etc., Tunisia, Morocco, etc. And then we have in Asia. And so it's a considerable part of the colonial discourse. And I just have to say one thing, that the book, Glory, because we are here to sort of present to you this book, I will talk about my views about culture, because politics and culture are inextricably related. After all, you can't sort of compartmentalize them. You cannot, even if you try to. And it's not fair, it's not correct, I would say. But at the same time, let me say that the book begins with an extremely readable novel. An extremely readable novel. And as the blue, white, and red tricolor of France is ceremoniously lowered from public buildings across the country, he says, and replaced by the saffron, white, and green tricolor of India.
What if, it's like a what if kind of a situation.
Yes, beautiful. And he talks about the roads named in French, like, for example, Rue François Martin in Pondicherry, Rue de la Compagnie, etc. And then he goes on to say what is more serious, is that very few people know who is Dupleix. So he goes deep into it, digs deeper, and it's a very important document. I mean, it's a kind of clinical analysis of what went on, because we don't know much about it, though there are many books on the subject. I must say, it's not quite a forgotten history, because we all know about Jean-Marie Lafon's book, I like very much, Indo-French Relations. We have a very important book by Holden Farber, which is called Rival Empires of Trade in the Orient.
Right.
We have, etc. There are many. But what is important is, this is the first time he's trying to be dispassionate and sometimes tongue-in-cheek and very openly impartial, I would say, in some ways. And now over to him.
Yeah, but there is a very interesting thing. If you read the book, the Tryst with Destiny speech by Nehru, right? He writes it in French.
In French.
It could have been, delivered in French if the French
Were there.
the power. So that's like a very interesting situation in the beginning of the
Yeah,
book.
beautiful.
And then he, sort of comes back, holds back, and says that, okay, this never happened, but this could have happened, right? One small,
because the 17th and 18th century
Right.
France was very, very important as colonial rulers. But then they slided back. What exactly happened?
Yeah, perhaps it'd be useful just to briefly tell the story or flag up the key moments. So France arrives in India a couple of years after the foundation of the first French East India Company, the Compagnie des Indes, in the 1660s. It's only a few years before France is at war with a European rival in Indian waters. In the first instance, it's the Dutch who are the big rivals of the French. There are two wars between the French and the Dutch. fought in Europe and fought in India in the 1670s, the first one, and the 1690s, the second. So this idea that there was ever such a thing as peaceful commerce simply isn't the case. Commerce was always backed by violence or by the threat of force. So that's the first part of the book, if you like. There is then a period of commercial prosperity for France in India in the early 18th century, the 1720s, the 1730s. This is after the folding of the first French East India Company and the launch of a second company. And then maybe the key part of the book is the chapters 5 and 6 that follow that talk about this crucial period of French imperial expansion. So it's in the 1740s and the early 1750s that France succeeds through a combination of
alliances
and alliances. Exactly. Yeah. Some key alliances with other central and southern Indian powers, succeeds in becoming a major territorial power in its own right. This is the moment when France installs. Well,
that was the time of Louis XIV, the Sun King, Louis XIV, and it started then and continued till Charles de Gaulle. In the 20th century. Carry on.
No, thank you, for that point. So Louis XIV is pursuing similar projects of conquest and of territorial expansion in other parts of the world at this time as well. This is not simply reserved to India. France succeeds in installing sympathetic, possibly compliant figures in power in the Mughal provinces of the Deccan and the Carnatic in about the year 1750. And at that moment, if we look at a map, if you look at a map of territories that France controls, but also territories over which it has a large degree of influence, we're looking at large parts of central and southern India in French control. So when the book opens up until 1947, well, it's the idea that that empire survived and grew in the years that follow instead of quite quickly collapsing. The collapse comes from the mid-1750s. And by as early as the year 1761, France is reduced to a position in India where it has 5 relatively small colonies around the coastline of India, including Chandanagar, and of course Pondicherry, Mahe, Yangon, and Karikal. Thank you. From that moment onwards, France is restricted to those 5 colonies, but that doesn't mean that French ambitions to recover a more significant empire in India come to an end. So the final part of the book is about the period after 1760. The French return to India after the end of a 7 Years' War, but they are very interested in recovering their position and in challenging the growing British ascendancy.
The 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763 was actually a struggle for global dominance between the French and the English, basically. And then something happened.
Yeah, that's right. The collapse comes quite quickly when it comes. I think by 1754, the British realized that if they don't do something, France is going to dominate large parts of India. So the British began backing a rival candidate to power in southern India, in the Carnatic, the figure who becomes Nawab Muhammad Ali with British backing.
Against Chanda Sahib, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. Chanda Sahib is the rival candidate that the French have briefly installed in power before the British begin backing Muhammad Ali. And many of you will no doubt be familiar with the events that follow in Bengal when the 7 Years' War begins. In Bengal, the British begin by taking the French colony of Chandanagar. This is the event that precedes, of course.
Is it the Battle of Chandanagar, right?
Yeah, there's a siege. There's
the siege of Chandanagar.
From the river.
Yeah.
So British ships sail up the river. They bombard Chandanagar, which surrenders quite quickly.
Yeah.
It's interesting that even at that moment, with the war between Britain and France underway, the French are almost as worried about the intentions of the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dawla, as they are about the intentions of the British. And so at no point do the aggression of the British towards France at that moment at Chandanagar comes as a little bit of a surprise. But then from that moment onwards, there is, I guess, a domino effect where other remaining French possessions in India fall quite quickly.
Yeah.
Possessions on the east coast of India, the Sirkars region, and then possessions in the south as well. The final collapse of this nascent French Empire in India comes when the British take Pondicherry in, I think, January 1761.
Yep. So for the uninitiated, you know, Plassey actually happened in 1757, but it's in November, if I'm not wrong. And the Battle of Chandanagar, or Siege of Chandanagar, happens in January 1757. So
March and June.
March and June. So it's just like 3-4 months gap, but that was enough, you know, to tilt the kind of. There is this apocryphal story of Clive being, you know, just saved by a whisker, by certain things, but he just survived to become, you know, the all controlling power. Chinmoy, you know, so these are all historical facts. So I can ask another question to, you know, Professor Ivermee, and then go to.
There's one thing I'd like to point out about the book before I move on to my argument.
Please.
Is that it's very, very important. I think it throws light on very, very important issues we don't know. I mean, he has researched like a true scholar who is totally devoted to his work, even if it's totally unconventional. And he throws light on the French slave trading.
Yeah.
Very important. Apart from the colonial trade, the French slave trading, and as far as I can gather, up to the decade of 1730s, the French export of slaves from India rose to an alarming level. This is something we didn't know.
Yeah.
And where they sent to Mauritius, I don't know.
Yeah. So another thing, Professor Ivermee, if I'm allowed to, you know, just speculate on it. I mean, I want your opinion on that. So there is also a brilliant piece in the book where, you know, the revolution happens, you know, the French Revolution happens, and it's built on this, you know, liberty, equality, fraternity. And on the other hand, in the colonies, that's not the case. So here is France championing the cause of this equality in Europe, but at the same time, it's a colonizer. How did they reconcile?
Yeah, there are two aspects. I mean, the colonizer and
the colonizer.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge difference, and this happened with the British always. I mean, we know about Rabindranath's comment that they are choto English, borrow English, etc. So this happened. I will talk about it. Voltaire's admiration for India. Fragment sur l'Inde. It's amazing. It's amazing. So all of them, I will talk about that later on. I just wanted to know about this slave trade.
Well, in many respects, these 2 points, one about slavery and the other about the revolution, go together. So on slavery first, we are used, at least to an extent, to thinking about European slave trading in the Atlantic Ocean, the trade of enslaved people from primarily the west coast of Africa across the Atlantic towards the Caribbean and North America, South America as well, actually, in the case of the Spanish and Portuguese. We're far less accustomed to thinking about European slave trading in the Indian Ocean. It's something that has been very much understudied. As far as India is concerned, and as far as the book is concerned, in the Indian Ocean, Mauritius and Reunion Island become important French colonies in the first decades of the 18th century. Their economies are mostly about plantations, growing primarily coffee. And for that plantation economy, slaves are imported. Now, most of those slaves come from the east coast of Africa, or they come from Madagascar. But there are records of small but growing numbers of enslaved people being taken from, well, primarily from South India, and taken to those islands. But when it comes to giving people more freedom, when it comes to recognizing the rights of people who are not born in France, who are not men, who are not white, it's a very different story. The statistic is in the book, but it's roughly 200 out of a population of some 60 or 80,000 in Pondicherry by the time of the revolution are recognized as citizens in this new political regime that is installed by the revolution. It's a tiny minority. You have to be a man, you have to own a certain amount of property, you have to be born in France or have a parent or grandparent born in France.
But during the French Revolution, they addressed each other. You must be knowing it's not monsieur and madame. They addressed each other as citoyens. Citoyen Robespierre, citoyen, that's fantastic. It's like comrade of the left revolution. Right. So it's very interesting. They called each other citoyen and citizen, and he mentioned that. But in France, Robert, they respected the woman as citoyenne, so not in Pondicherry.
In the colonies, in fact.
In the colonies.
In France as well, women are very briefly recognized as citizens in, I think, the 1794 constitution that's passed by the National Assembly in France. That constitution is very quickly suspended. So in practice, the rights of women aren't significantly improved either. In the case of Pondicherry, the Tamil population, of course, asks to be recognized as citizens. Right. The Indo-Portuguese population asks to be recognized as citizens and to have these new rights, for example, to vote for a representative form of government. But it's very clear that the French population of Pondicherry is not willing to share the new rights that it has found under this regime with, well, with anybody else.
Did Pondicherry become the epicenter?
It did. Pondicherry is always the most significant French colony of the 5 that we have mentioned. It's the colony that establishes a representative assembly. The other 4 colonies of French India are supposed to send representatives to this new institution. It's from Pondicherry that several deputies are sent to the National Assembly that has been established back in Paris at this time. So yes, and when the constitution is written at the time of the revolution, well, it's written in Pondicherry. So very much so. There is, though, a rebellion on the part of the citizens of Chandanagar who don't want to follow Pondicherry in this new regime and try to go it on their own to establish their own system of government and to communicate directly with Paris instead of having to pass via Pondicherry. There is a rivalry between Pondicherry and Chandanagar throughout much of this period.
Yes.
I just want to ask Robert something. What was the situation during the Napoleonic era?
Well,
because it all stopped in 1814.
Yeah, exactly. So this brings us to the end of the story, really, the penultimate chapter of the book, before the postscript, which is about the legacies after 1814. But in the Napoleonic era, France makes its final attempts basically to organize some sort of military action in India, to send a force to try to invade India, to dislodge the British from their dominant position, because, of course, the revolution in France has declenched a new war between Britain and France around the world. The first attempt to invade India under Napoleon comes following the French invasion and occupation of Egypt in 1798. The occupation of Egypt is intended as a precursor to an advance on India by Napoleon. Those plans are defeated and Napoleon has to return to France. A few years later, if we wind on the story, Napoleon has become emperor in France, and he plans, well, either an invasion of India by the sea route, so sailing around the Cape of Good Hope, of course, and into the Indian Ocean, building up forces on Mauritius that might eventually be used to invade India. There's also a plan to organize some sort of land campaign through Persia into India, a treaty signed with the Shah of Persia in about the year 1807. When that plan falls apart, it basically marks the end of any remaining imperial ambitions that France has. And a couple of years later, Mauritius and Reunion Island are captured by the British, and France's positions, France has been stripped of all of its possessions in, well, not just India, but the Indian Ocean.
Entire ocean. Chinmoy, we have to return to that first question, that because that requires, so this is not in the book, but there is always that afterlife that any book has, right?
There is something, always there is something beyond the text.
Right.
Beyond history. He's a historian, and it's a historian's document, and he regrets that colonialism is synonymous with the British in India. For all of us, colonialism means British, and to a certain extent to the Portuguese in Goa, and he regrets that no popular films about Indian heroes was made who were struggling against the French rule. I believe that this is I don't know, this is not a historian's problem. British imperialism was a far greater menace for us. So for all of us, so that's an important aspect. But something very important before I start speaking, I take over for some time. Pinaki happens to be the country's leading cover designer. everybody knows him as a leading cover designer in the country, and he's a professor, of course, a Dr. Pinaki, and who writes graphic novels, and one of the master interviewers that we ever had in the last decade. Now, to come back to what I had to say, it's a very important aspect. There is another aspect. Look at the title of this session. It is Glorious Failure, and then Cultural Allies. Now, Robert makes a statement which is very interesting, but all of us will not agree with it. It may not. One thing is sure, despite major disruptions, collapse of companies, wars, and a revolution, France maintained a colonial presence and acted in imperialist way. He says that. But there are other things. We all know, just because it was natural for us to regard them as binaries, the British and French. So the British, of course, outmaneuvered the French. But he says in his book, very objectively, that Dupleix was cantankerous, haughty, and impatient.
We should perhaps clarify for anyone who's not aware that Dupleix is the Governor General in the crucial period of French imperial expansion in the 1740s and 50s. He's the main figure in the middle part of the book, whose imperial ambitions are briefly realized before being shattered.
It's a fascinating figure.
Yeah, he devotes a lot of space to Dupleix. But at the same time, he also mentions, and we all know that Lord Clive was a sociopath and was mentally unstable.
So even Stevens.
And so that is there. All colonial powers are like that. Lethal. France was lethal, I must say. And they did something, even though I'm a Francophile, some say Franco-maniac, I can say with complete honesty that French colonies in Africa, for example, completely brainwashed the people. Lavage du cerveau. And if you ask one of them who is the greatest poet, they would say Baudelaire, which we won't do. We mentioned Rabindranath. So the British could not go that far. The French did because of their, these qualities. They had special qualities. Now, what is important is, this is very, very important. He mentions it. I'm grateful to him. This is very interesting for all of us. France was perceived as an anti-imperialist power in India, committed to the protection of India from British aggression. Very important. If you look at Tipu Sultan. Now, what is important is, we thought that France had a responsibility to rescue, as he says, the people of India from oppressive English rule. Amra shobai France dike. So that's very important. And then he says something which I would like to contest. He said that after the French Revolution, very interesting, he says that France could export the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Liberté, égalité, et fraternité. After the French Revolution, they started exporting it. And I don't think it can be exported. It happens. When you fall in love with somebody, it happens. So this is an aspect I would like. This is my version, of course. You may not agree with me. But I think this is very important. I think it's more than a rhetoric of liberty. More than a rhetoric of liberty. This is very important. For example, I'm giving you some example of that. For example, the hexagon. France is a hexagon. If you look at the map of France, is the hexagon. It's called l'hexagone in French. Hexagon has always remained dreamland for most people on earth. And for us, of course, a culture which really had much to offer. And when we are dominated by the British, we are looking for an alternative discourse. And France was part of that alternative discourse. It was part of the Indians' quest for an alternative discourse. And I'll give you an example. Do you know that the first holy habit of shrugging off things, responsibilities. Very interesting. It's almost every dictionary is a cultural product. Like every other writing, écriture. What is important is very, very important. প্রথম থেকেই বলছি, Voltaire কি বলেছে? Voltaire বলেছে. It's Voltaire who said, Voltaire, 18th century. He said, I am convinced that everything has come down to us from the books of the Ganges. Astronomy, astrology, metaphysics. It does not behove us to dispute their antiquity, because we were savages and barbarians. Voltaire says it. We are savages and barbarians, and when Indian and Chinese people were civilized and learned. Who comes? Voltaire, who had nothing to do with any cultural or political, colonial politics. And he again castigates colonialism in Candide, when he talks about a man in Suriname. Now, what is important is the Vedas, Voltaire said, were the first precious gift for which the West had been indebted to the East. একটা উদাহরণ দিলাম, Voltaire কি বলেছে, and with the fables of La Fontaine, we all know, were influenced by Panchotantro directly. Just imagine. There's a difference between the British culture and the French culture. In the case of British, we are forced to know that Shakespeare is the greatest. And Nirod Chaudhuri writes that in India, the colonized India translated more Shakespeare than anyone in the rest of the world. It was translated everywhere, in Persian, in Oriya, in Bengali, everywhere. Shakespeare was ubiquitous. And now, but in the case of French, it was a choice. Amra Franske pochondo korchi. Keno pochondo korchi? We all know that Raja Ram Mohan Rai, while traveling abroad to Bristol, he had a broken leg, which is very exciting. And he was told that a French ship was passing by. That was in 1831. A French ship is passing by, and he dragged his broken feet outside. With his broken feet, came out and saluted the French flag and said, Liberté, égalité, fraternité. And Derozio hoisted the French flag on the Octogenary Monument in Calcutta in 1831, and threw a banquet where he invited Raja Ram Mohan Rai. So we see the interaction is different. There's a subterranean flow of love, and it is not one-sided at all. On the one hand, Subramaniam Bharati in Pondicherry, the great Tamil author, poet, he was greatly influenced. He was changed completely, and not only La Fontaine, the Fable de Fontaine, Baudelaire, for example, in 1840, he was going astray, and his father put him on to a ship for Calcutta. Just imagine, he embarked on a ship for Calcutta. Calcutta, just imagine, it would have been so Baudelairean if he had come, very Kafkaesque city. And he was coming here, the young Baudelaire, just imagine. But there was a problem with the ship, and he got off at Mauritius and Bourbon, La Réunion, and he thought that it was India because they were bonded laborers from India. And he fell in love with dark-skinned people, and his lover was, of course, Jeanne Duval, who was not fair. She was not. What is important is this two-way traffic started, and for Lamartine and Michelet, India was the cradle of the world. It is not Orientalism, as Edward Said would have said. It's a genuine feeling. And then it went on and on. Actually, I first heard of the French East India Company because I was young and I was translating Romain Rolland's plays on the French Revolution, and the play was called Danton, and they were talking about La Compagnie des Indes.
Yeah, company.
And I later learned that it was formed in 1664, which was the decade of Molière, Racine, Corneille. And not only Molière, Racine, Corneille, but also in England, Milton, who was writing Paradise Lost, which was published in 1667. Just imagine course, against authoritarianism, and this was happening in other places. Look at the contradiction, the paradox. But this went on, and for example, Michael Madhusudhan Dotto, this is very exciting. Michael Madhusudhan Dotto wrote in a letter, he was in Versailles and about to be imprisoned for debt. তখনকার দিনে ধার করার জন্য ধার শোধ না করলে জেলে পড়া হতো. We know about that from Dickens's novels. And now এখানে কি হলো, he writes in a letter, বলছে আমি আত্মহত্যা করবো এরকম একটা অবস্থা. সেই সময় লিখছেন, only Michael Madhusudhan could do it. He had no compulsion. He had a compulsion to read Shakespeare, but not the French writers. Why should he? And he was in Versailles, not in London, because he had racial problems there. And what did Michael write? He said, this is very interesting, though I have been very unhappy and full of anxiety here in France, I have nearly mastered French. Michael Madhusudhan Dotto, I have nearly mastered French. This is very interesting. And he says, I speak it well. Not easy to speak French, very correct. I speak it well and write it better.
Yeah, but
Michael Madhusudhan Dotto.
But you know, the one thing, just to play the devil's advocate here, you know, it may be that this is something like more like the middle class Indian, enlightened Indians that are thinking like that, you know. It may be that, you know, the percolation of French culture was lesser to some degree to, say, the general public. Is that the case? I mean, Professor, if you...
Well, there's no doubt that among educated people, middle class or higher class...
France was an idea after the revolution.
France was an idea, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. This idea that France represents freedom...
It's still there, you know.
...is a very powerful idea. It survives to this day. We see it at the time of the Indian nationalist movement, of course. Gandhi and Nehru and others speak about the freedoms that can be found in France. And the most concrete manifestation, I suppose, of that freedom is when Indian freedom fighters who were fleeing the British take refuge in colonies like Chandernagore and Pondicherry. That's a very concrete manifestation of this idea that we can find a freedom in France or in a French territory that we can't have under British rule. The origins of that idea that France represents freedom, I would actually argue, go back further than the revolution. They go back to the 1770s when France returns to India, and it begins to say, our purpose here should be to help the people of India to free themselves from the British. There's a very powerful rhetoric that...
That was just after the American independence, 1776, from the British.
Almost in parallel. I would almost argue that this rhetoric begins in relation to India and then adopted in relation to the cause of American freedom from the British a couple of years later. So when France begins helping an Indian power like the Kingdom of Mysore in its fight against the British in the 1760s, it's talking about freedom and it's adopting tactics like secretly sending weapons to that kingdom, but are then replicated to help the cause of the American Revolution 5 or 10 years later. So yeah, that's the idea of France representing freedom begins there. It then takes on a whole new level, I suppose, at the time of the revolution and the installation of, well, one of the world's first constitutions and representative governments, at least for a period of a few years. And yeah, just on the, one of your other points, there's no doubt that in the early 19th century, which is just beyond the main scope of the book, there's no doubt that at that point there is a huge curiosity for India in France, that France and Paris in particular becomes a center of Indology for the study of Sanskrit and other aspects of Indian civilization. Some scholars have even argued that after the defeat of its projects to politically conquer India, France takes it upon itself to...
Culturally.
Yeah, to culturally and intellectually become Europe's leading power in relation to India. Yes, so the political project is in many respects superseded by this intellectual or cultural project after 1815.
So thank you very much.
So we will give the last word to Chinmoy, because if you can...
explanation, thank you.
Yeah, but Chinmoy, the last word, of course, because we are also being... The time, you know, we are Yeah, we started it, but we also, it flew, right? Like
we want time for a few questions.
Yeah, no, but before that, Chinmoy has a small thing to tell.
No, but much more to tell. Do you know that Jyotirindranath, সবাই বলি, do you know that Jyotirendra translated Molière, Racine, Gautier, Pirlotti, Balzac, Victor Hugo, Maupassant? Do you know that if Rabindranath had not read Maupassant's Conte de la Bécasse, he wouldn't have perhaps written those great short stories? And we can't have this session without mentioning Toru Dotto, who died at the age of 21, brought out an anthology. She was born in 1856, and she brought out an anthology of French gleaned from French fields, and where she translated Baudelaire, who was not known in Paris at that time, and then of course not well known in Paris, and she wrote the first French novel, the Journal of Mademoiselle d'Arvers. So things were going on in a big way. It was a love, and Rabindranath was very young, and do you know what he was reading? When he was young, গাছে মাটিতে বসে মোজা নেই পায়ে জুতো নেই রবীন্দ্রনাথ ঠাকুর পানিহাটিতে বসে কি পড়ছেন পৌলো বর্জিনী বলে একটা উপন্যাস প্রেমের উপন্যাস Paul et Virginie, written by Bernardin de Saint-Pierre in 1768, and he was reading it ওইখানে বসে অশ্রু বিসর্জন করছেন. So Rabindranath was reading it. যে রবীন্দ্রনাথ পরে বলবেন বিশ্বকে আমার চাই নইলে আমি বাঁচি নে. Sutrang, it's very important to remember, Robert, because the British are very important. They have a great contribution, I would say, paradoxically, because of that encounter with the British. It opened all the horizons, opened all the windows, and we started interacting with the West. I think after our knowledge of English, we started knowing the world, and then we realized that he is my choice. And Romain Rolland, for example, all of India, from Radhakrishnan to Lala Lajpat Rao to Gandhiji, Rabindranath three times, everyone, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, Jawaharlal Nehru, they all gravitated towards a Frenchman and not any British author. They went to meet Romain Rolland, who
people in the 19th century that allows for that
So maybe
cross-cultural exchange to take place from a situation of, well,
and Swami Vivekananda went to France. And do you know that Swami Vivekananda spoke French? And one of his disciples, great disciples, was one of the greatest actors, one says these days, Sarah Bernhardt. And Vivekananda wrote in Prachur Paschatto, Ei France Shadhinotar Abash. This France is the house of freedom. Vivekananda says, this is very important. As part of the binary. And look at Vivekananda, he said, France is the fountainhead of European civilization in the modern era.
yeah.
Shobhata Gangar Gomukh. Now,
So we have to end it here, but you know there is one thing I just want to, because I want to give Robert also this. So maybe from our point of view, because you know the British were a much bigger kind of a power, maybe our love for the French also comes from that love for the underdog, right? But maybe a Fanon would have disagreed. So maybe a Fanon would have disagreed, and he doesn't talk a lot about great, you know, French literature.
No, this is something that we don't have time to talk about in huge detail now.
Yeah.
But we need to understand that it's quite possible for two very different things to coexist.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you have this idea that France represents freedom, but on the other hand, you have the reality that right up until the 1960s, at least, France is a major colonial power in many parts of the world. Yeah. Exploring that contradiction and how it is possible for those two things to live side by side for so...
এত ভালো অনুবাদ করেন তো ফ্রান্স ভট্টাচার্য বললেন অত তেল দিও না.
The question, please.
Sir, I have a
be
question.
short and maybe a
And that is
Was the French cultural marginality in Bengal an accident of British dominance or an outcome of deliberately limited, elite-oriented imperial project along the Hooghly?
Robert?
Yeah, I think...
That's a good question.
I think it's in Pondicherry that France maintained and still maintains a far more significant cultural presence. When we look at Pondicherry today, we have still a succession of French cultural institutions like the Alliance Française, the Lycée.
I live in a road called Rue de Marie, so like, so it's
in
French.
Bengal too, we translate from French literature more than from any other language.
Okay.
Okay, but please.
So that cultural presence survives. I think it's maybe particularly striking in the case of Pondicherry because it's on a bigger
Right.
scale, and because when you go to Pondicherry, you have still this very clear divide between
Black Town.
what's called the White Town and the Black Town,
Right.
which of course, pointing out the obvious, is a colonial inheritance. Just to kind of finish the story of French India, for anybody who's not aware, we need to remember that the 5 small colonies of French India remain in French hands right through until the 1950s. They are only returned to the Republic of India in
190 years. Can you give me one advantage and disadvantage as a colonized subject of France, what we would have been enjoyed? Now, please, for God's sake, don't say that this Lit Fest would have been in French instead of English.
No, but yes, it would have been in French perhaps. And another thing, very important, আপনি যেটা বললেন, বুদ্ধদেব বোস, one of the finest writers here in Bengal, উনি বলেছেন যে ফ্রেঞ্চরা যদি আমাদের ঔপনিবেশিক প্রভু হতো তাহলে আমরা শিল্প সংস্কৃতিটাকে আরো ভালো বুঝতাম, আমরা আর্টকে বুঝতাম, আমরা স্কাল্পচারকে বুঝতাম, আমরা শুধু ওই শেক্সপিয়ারে সীমাবদ্ধ থাকতাম না, আমরা হয়তো আরো বিস্তৃত হতাম। এটা খুব ইন্টারেস্টিং পয়েন্ট। Disadvantage is, in my opinion, I will pass on to him, I think Robertson.
I'm not sure I have an answer, to be honest. I think it's extremely difficult, although the book opens with
Very
this kind
speculative as well.
of
Right?
counterfactual scenario. It's very difficult to play the game of what if. I suppose that because one of the striking differences, there are 2 striking differences between Britain and France when I look at the 2 countries today. One is the political system, France being a republic and the United Kingdom being still a kingdom. The second big difference is France's tradition since the early 20th century of secular country with a secular state and a secular set of laws, and the UK's tradition of still having a close connection between church and state. So I guess India would have followed, had it been a French colony for much longer, a tradition that was more republican, a tradition that was more anti-religious.
That's fantastic. That's a fantastic answer.
But
Ah,
the negative side of it, the negative side is that there was always a difference between events going on in France and events going on in French colonies right through until the latter half of the 20th century.
thank you so much
Absolutely.
for being a patient
Excellent.
audience. It has been a wonderful history lesson for all of us. And I thank Professor Ivermee and Professor Guha. I've been educated. I hope you are going home knowing a